All right, today we're working on this 2007 6.7 Cummins. We got a couple parts to put in. We got this fancy TVM Mega-Flo grid heater from GDP. We got this super fancy GDP Air Boss for the grid heater delete. It comes with a nice set of gaskets and a nice set of instructions. And then so far, we're gonna need these tools, a 15/16 for the fuel connecting tube lock nut, a 3/4 inch crow's foot for the actual fuel lines off the fuel rail, a 1/2 inch 17 mil, 10 mil, and then a 17 millimeter ratcheting wrench. All right, so we're gonna start off with the install of the Air Boss and the grid heater. There's a couple things that I gotta take care of while we're doing this. So we're gonna start off here with the instructions, disconnecting the negative battery, removing the charger cooler, moving the engine oil dipstick mounting from the intake horn and the fuel filter housing if needed, and then disconnecting the air grid heater power cables with the cable mounting studs. All right, so on the truck here, we're gonna disconnect these 6 bolts. This one here, there's one back here behind this fuel rail that you can't really see, one back there, and then there's one way down in here that you also can't see. So we're gonna disconnect this clamp here and pull this whole thing out, and then we'll come back to you as soon as we got that. All right, so I forgot to mention, we gotta disconnect our IAT here and this little probe back here as well. All right, so right back here on the back side of the intake horn, there's also a 10 millimeter bolt holding this wire harness in place. There's also a connector for this. I'll show you that here in just a second when I get to it. All right, this is the connector for that little probe on the back of the intake. It's got one of those stupid little red clips on it, so make sure you unlock that so you don't break it. All right, so next steps, we're gonna pull the vent line off here. We're gonna pull the vent line off here, set them out of the way. Then we're gonna disconnect this injector harness right here, get it out of the way. And then next you're gonna disconnect your intake sensor up here, pull that out, get this last little harness right here out of the way as well. All right, so we got one little sensor back there left, so I'm gonna start disconnecting fuel lines. I already got number 1 out. Make sure you're using the backing wrench while loosening these. Last thing you wanna do is lose the torque on your connecting tubes. Also, be careful not to spill fuel everywhere, kind of like I did. So we're gonna take off number 2 and probably number 3 to get to that sensor, and hopefully that'll help us get it out. All right, so we got 1, 2, and 3 out. Thing to note, it goes 1, 2, and then 3 is actually after 4 on the rail itself. All right, so next thing on the list, we're gonna disconnect this guy. It goes down to the fuel filter housing right down there, this little cable. And then we got in the very, very back, a sensor right there where my finger is. We gotta disconnect the cable off of that one as well. And I'm hoping we'll be able to get this rail out so we can get to this thing easier. It's just basically not wanting to disconnect. All right, so we got all 6 fuel lines out. What a pain. I also disconnected the sensor back there. Make sure you do that before you pull the fuel rail. Now we're ready to pull the fuel rail, which will be this bolt. This bolt was already pulled when I took off this wire and harness bracket right here. And then it'll be this bolt here and this bolt right here. All right, fuel rail is out. So now we're gonna take out the remainder of this Air Boss here. So we got that one bolt back there, right corner. We got this bolt right here behind the sensor, the one right in front of it, and then this one right here. All right, so the plenum's off. I'm gonna take the opportunity now to clean all this up, clean it all out. All right, so next is to clean up the intake shelf. Mine's a little rusty, not a big deal. And then make sure you drop nothing down this intake shelf, or if you do, at least vacuum it out. I had to do that with mine because there's a lot of buildup right here. All right, so here's the old intake plenum out. And this little bolt right here is the whole reason we're doing this. I will say that this one's super tight. Usually you want to replace them when they get loose, or as you notice they get loose, that's time to replace them because this will actually fall down into the pistons. Don't forget to take this little sensor out. This is the air intake sensor. It has a little crush washer on it like you can see here. You can either cut that off or leave it. If you cut it off, GDP does include a new O-ring, which is right here. You can put on it instead of this crush washer. Now I know mine's fairly new, so I'm just gonna send it and we'll go from there. All right, so this is the factory intake horn. We're gonna be putting the new GDP Mega-Flo grid heater onto this. Basically, you just remove these 4 bolts all the way around, and you're good to go. All right, so we got the grid heater on, and if you're like me and had one of these fancy little things, bolts aren't long enough, so you're gonna need 4 of these guys, and I put some flat washers and a lock washer underneath each one just to make sure they ain't gonna come back out. All right, intake plenum in, fuel rail is going in. The bolts that are on the plenum itself are torqued to 18 foot-pounds, the same as the 4 bolts that will be installed on the fuel rail. All right, fuel rail is back in, everything's torqued. Fuel rail side of the fuel lines are 27 foot-pounds. The block side is 22 foot-pounds. Got all 6 back in. Got this dipstick hooked back up to the fuel rail. Got the feed from the CP3 hooked back up. Now we're gonna work on getting all this wiring cleaned up. All right, so we got everything buttoned back up. Got the new GDP grid heater installed. All the connections on the intake manifold are plugged back in. All the bolts here torqued to 18 foot-pounds. Dipstick reconnected. I think we're ready to see if this thing will fire up now. All right, so we got this GDP grid heater in, just showing where the stud goes, or the cable for the grid heater goes. It's right here on the back side, pinched between those 2 nuts. Be careful not to over tighten them because you can destroy the element inside.